So what I'm going to do now is share my screen, talk a little bit about some material, and then leave some time at the end for questions. But if any of you all have any questions anytime during the lecture, please chime in, because the most boring thing in the world for me is to hear myself talk. So I want you to chime in, interrupt, raise a hand, go, Rodriguez, what do you mean there? Right? Or can you explain yourself? Please, please, please. I don't think any of you ever had me for one-on-one classes. I don't think so. But the way I historically teach lecture is just a much more back and forth, right? So if you even like have to make up a question to make me feel good, that would make me smile. All right, just make something up. All right, Ari, got you. Let's share the screen. Dun, dun, dun. So I want to make sure you all listen to this podcast. And if you have trouble listening to it, you can also read the transcript of this podcast. This is assignment 1, part 2. And it's a really powerful 2-part podcast about America's state of mind. They interview Daniel Imaway, who is a University of Washington historian. He's very accessible, and it's a really cool complement, I think, to help you understand a little bit about the rise of U.S. empire in the late 1900s. And again, this is in your course. Here is what we're going to be studying today. Part 2, what's the U.S.'s relationship with other countries and peoples? And within this, I'm going to click on the questions and materials, and this is where all the questions and materials are for assignment 2. I'm going to scroll down. Okay, I've already posted the slides to today's lecture. After Zoom processes this lecture, I will post a video link to this lecture. And these are the questions we're going to be dealing with, right, relating to the age of U.S. empire. The podcast I'm having you listen to is Empire State of Mind. Okay, and each part of the podcast is about 15 minutes long. It's really cool. Has anybody had a chance to listen to the podcast yet? Raise your hand or give me some, yeah? So Emily, what's your take on the podcast? Please help me sell it to other students.
Well, I mean, I'm not a big podcast person. I listen to a few here and there, but the fact that this was talking about like Roosevelt and like different things in that sense, he is my favorite president personally. I did find that interesting, and I was talking like the Panama Canal and like different aspects of his presidency, which I really find interesting anyway. That's like the one part of history I actually like learning about. Because I'm not a big history buff, to be honest.
Oh, yeah, it's okay. I'm a history buff. And what got me really into history was this era of U.S. history, the early 1900s, also called the Progressive Age.
Yeah, the Progressive Age.
I was a nerdy student at Sonoma State. One of my first big research papers was about this era. And if Teddy Roosevelt would be running in 2020, I think I'd have to vote for him.
I mean, I just really like him because I'm an agriculture major. So It's interesting to learn his aspects on like the national park system, and then different ideas of like imports and exports, different things like that.
Great. And in assignment 2, when we talk about the progressive era, we'll be delving even deeper into some of Roosevelt's policies.
Sweet.
Right. Not that I think he was a perfect leader. None of them are, but he was definitely led from the front.
Oh, yes.
All right. So let me share the screen again. Where'd you go? Hold on. Rodriguez, technical difficulties. There we go. All right, so let me begin. Lecture, Rise of U.S. Empire, boring first slide. So in the early 1900s, if you looked at a map of the world, right, a political map of the world and saw, geez, which nations had colonies abroad, you can really dive down into this map and notice that, these relatively small nations in Western Europe had successfully colonized large areas of Africa, large areas of the Southern Hemisphere, India, Southeast Asia, down in here, the East Indies. Okay, so imperialism in 1914 was at its height, right before World War I started. Okay, and the U.S. wants to take part in this. As you saw from maybe the last lecture, the U.S. has become an economic and political giant compared to, well, similar to Germany, Britain, and France at this time. An example of European imperialism in Africa, those of you who ever take my History 3 class, we delve into this quite deeply, is this. Here is how European leaders carved up and drew boundaries across Africa. Basically, it's called the Scramble for Africa. So 90% of the African territory was at least claimed by either the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the German, the Belgians, or the Italians. Right, the outliers were Ethiopia. How many of you all seen Black Panther, that film? Black Panther, and didn't the artist just recently pass away, the actor? So Black Panther is a fictional take on Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of the only African countries who were successfully able to reject European colonialism. So next time you do the Wakanda thing, think of Ethiopia. All right, in my History 3 class, I'll teach it next semester, we go deeper into it. So how did Europeans do this? Well, at the Berlin Conference in Berlin, Germany in 1885, leaders from many European nations and the United States got together in Berlin and carved up a map of Africa. Who's missing from the conference? Who is not there? Who wasn't invited to the party? Rachel, I see you smiling.
I would say not a single African.
Not a single African. This is my main takeaway for you all, because this is when we talk about Cuba, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, it's going to have a direct relation to this. So while these movers and shakers in Europe were carving up the African borders, no Africans invited to the party. But most Europeans wore this as a point of pride. Right here's Cecil Rhodes, the diamond, British-based, self-defined empire person. Look at him spanning Africa with, this is telegraph wire, right? His goal was to develop Africa with telegraph wire, and here he is man-spreading over Africa, okay? Well, the United States wants to do the similar thing, but to, where's my man-spreader? There's Uncle Sam, the man-spreader. So here's Uncle Sam, right, man-spreading over the Americas. So just as Europe was expanding into Africa and Southeast Asia, the United States also wanted to play what Mark Twain called the European game. Okay? Because as historians rarely make history, but this historian has, in 1893 at the Chicago World Fair, Frederick Turner gave a speech called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he basically argued that by 1890, what we know as the continental United States, the lower 48, the frontier was declared closed by the Census Bureau. What that basically means, it's boring diplomatic talk for the US had conquered, for the most part, most of indigenous America, right? So by 1890, there's no more frontier to be conquered from Native Americans. And some Americans were like, wait a minute, this had defined our nation since its inception. The settlement and growth and moving, hold on, I think we have a person trying to come in with chat and I don't know how to invite him in. Do we? Okay, pardon me. So where are we going to expand to next? This is what many folks thought. And how are we gonna expand? Well, if we're going to expand, you know, it takes a strong army to conquer territories like this. But if you're going to expand overseas, what do you need militarily? What aspect of your military do you need to boost up? If you're going to do overseas. Sorry?
A navy.
Yeah, a navy.
I mean, airplanes probably weren't invented yet, so.
Yeah, not airplanes yet. Yep, those will come pretty soon, but not yet. Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was the head of the Navy, said, you know what, if we're going to step it up and compete with European colonization efforts throughout the world, we need to have a strong Navy. That's the future. Just as many people today think controlling space might be the future where we have future military conflicts. I sure as heck hope not. That sounds so dystopian and apocalyptic, but that's just me. So this guy Mahan advocated for and was successful in getting the United States federal government to invest a lot of money into building a Navy. And we're going to build a Navy using our great economic might. Remember, Carnegie was making a lot of steel. United States manufacturers were making all kinds of stuff, and we turned it into these big steel ships. One of the first places in which we were able to flex our naval strength was in Hawaii. Has anybody been to Hawaii? No? Oh, Kaylee, did you like it? Let me just hear a Hawaii story.
I've actually been to when I was younger, we went to like Pearl Harbor, like down there, and it was pretty cool.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor on the east side of the island. Yeah, I went to that one island too. I know that one well.
Yeah, we've gone quite a few times. We recently not last summer, but the summer before that, we went to Maui.
Oh yes, I love, the warm waters of Hawaii.
Yes.
Unlike the cold, violent Pacific Ocean that will suck you under, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you for that Hawaii escape. So Hawaii, how did it happen that Kaylee and I can go to Hawaii as US citizens and not have to show our passport? Well, in 1881, Queen Lily, I'm going to call her Queen Lily because I don't want to mess up her name, but Lily Uokalani, pardon me, Queen Lily. So Queen Lily was the monarch of Hawaii. Hawaii had a generations-long monarchy. In fact, Hawaii was the last big piece of land on Earth to be inhabited by people. The last big chunk of land on Earth where people went and lived was Hawaii, and this was about 5,000 years ago. I might be getting my thousands wrong, but something like that. So in 1891, she embarked on a policy that was not as favorable to US sugar planters. About 40 years earlier, the first US sugar planters went, like C&H Sugar and others, went and started planting sugar and pineapples in Hawaii and made a huge profits. But in 1891, many Hawaiians were saying, wait a minute, let's tax these US companies a little bit so we can build roads, we can build infrastructure, because they're exporting a lot of our Hawaiian wealth in the form of sugar. How do you think many of these US-based sugar planters felt about her increasingly nationalistic policies? If you were the CEO of C&H Sugar in Hawaii, how would you feel about these policies? Paxton, Ari, Joey, Rachel, Kaylee, or Emily, can I pick on you? How would you feel if you were Sanford Dole? What do you think, Joey?
American businessmen have never liked taxes.
Yeah, even if she was asking for a very modest rate of taxation in order to build roads, right? How do you think they do all the stuff on I-5? It's our tax money repaving I-5 every 2 years. So you're exactly right. US sugar interests got together and said, hey, Washington, D.C., can we send in the US Marines and oust Queen Lily? Because we aren't standing for it. And sure enough, that's what they did. The US Marines come in, Queen Lily steps down, and Sanford Dole was named the president of the territory of Hawaii. And it's interesting, I said named, right? He's not what? How are we going to choose our president in November, hopefully?
He wasn't elected.
Wasn't elected. He was named the president of the territory of Hawaii. So this goes to my larger argument of arguing that the US was expanding, and you could define it as an empire if you looked at the example of Hawaii. None of the Hawaiians got to vote for Sanford Dole. But then again, none of the Hawaiians got to vote for Queen Lily, right? She was a monarch. Right? Remember, history is not easy, black and white. I'm trying to show you all the nuances of it. Have you all heard of the Sanford Dole? What might that refer to? When I say the word dole, does that have any meaning to y'all?
The pineapple or the juice stuff. Can I say something really quick about what you said about them not voting for Queen Lily?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't necessarily think that you would disagree with this, but I feel like a monarch that is of your own people versus an imposed foreign, essentially, monarch is kind of different, because if you're a member of Hawaiian society, no, you didn't vote for your monarch, but you did, like, your societal contract that you're participating in is allowing for this monarch, versus this more technologically advanced society that is essentially forcing you to agree to it by force.
What do y'all think? Do y'all agree with Joey? Yeah, I'm giving you a thumbs up, Joey. I'm with you. But I just didn't want to, I'm with you, right? This is a traditional monarchy. She came from one of the most prominent families. This is some guy from the States who was imposed upon them. You're exactly right. So another reason why the US pursued a policy of empire was economic. Now the United States could grow different items in these tropical regions that you could not grow. Pineapples do not grow in the Fresno Valley, right? So many, many different tropically produced products, bananas, for example, could be grown, produced, and exported to the United States. And also now the United States can export its goods. Cotton was its #1 export to Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Cuba, and these other places I'll talk about. So there's economic incentives as well for expanding empire. Okay. Another data point in our discussion is the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire is the oldest in Europe at this time. It started about 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But by the late 1800s, it's diminishing, right? It's definitely experienced a lot of shrinkage. Here it is, Spanish Empire in 1890, comprised of not even all of Spain. Portugal had broken away, right? This area of northwestern Africa. These islands here, Puerto Rico is the circled one, Cuba, and the Philippines, and all these islands over here in the Pacific. So the Spanish Empire once comprised of most of the Americas. This is why we have all those Spanish names, San Francisco, Santa Rosa, right? San Miguel, for all these places in the West, because they were once part of Spain. However, in the late 1800s, the Spanish strength is waning and the United States strength is waxing. It's getting stronger. Another data point just to prove this is that look how many US military interventions happened during this 36-year period. All right, during this era, there was over 30 US military interventions in what I'm calling the Caribbean Basin, this whole region, right? From Venezuela all the way to Tampico and Veracruz to help with oil. There's oil interests here. Nicaragua has a canal interest here. We eventually build the canal right down here. So just as Europe, just as Europeans were expanding into Africa and South Asia, the United States claimed this area as, quote, our backyard, right? And we wanted Europe out. Here is President Roosevelt, right? Emily's a super fan. I don't know if she's going to get a tattoo of this image of Roosevelt, but she might. Here's a cartoon that just expresses Roosevelt's foreign policy at the time. And not just President Roosevelt, right? Many US foreign policymakers at the time. The US now had a big Navy, or was growing one, and the US wanted Europe out of the Americas. And the United States literally told other European nations through the Monroe Doctrine and other things you can read about in the book, that, hey, if you all have any problems in Latin America or the Americas, we will be the police force. For example, Venezuela owed England some money from a previous debt. The United States told England, don't go messing with Venezuela. We will send our Marines down. will go to Caracas and control the import-export place and get you your money back. And indeed, the US Marines did that, and indeed, England stayed back, and because England was the #1 military power at this time until World War I, right? But England said, okay, the United States, this will be your sphere of influence. And there's many, many more examples in which the United States intervened in our interests or in interest of Europeans. For example, the US Marines were in Nicaragua for many, many years. Have you all heard that very racist term gooks when it's called usually to Vietnamese people? Oh, good, I'm glad you haven't heard it. Very racist, nasty term. It was first actually coined by a few US Marines to talk about Nicaraguans in the 1910s. The US Marines were in Haiti in 1919. Again, collecting debts that Haiti had accrued, in this case with France. If you take my world history class, you'll understand why Haiti was in debt to France in the early 1900s. Let's venture now to Cuba. Cuba is the biggest island down here, island nation in the Gulf of Mexico. It's about the size of California, really big, a little smaller than California. So let's look at US occupation in Cuba. So Cuba was one of the last outposts of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, right? However, many Cubans did not want to be a part of the Spanish Empire. So for decades, Cuban rebels had fought against Spain in order to kick them out, right? So Cuba was part of this long 30-year war to kick Spain out. However, as the United States is expanding, do you think the United States wants Cuba to be independent all by themselves? What do you think? Oh, I'm getting my first yawn, Kaylee. Uh-oh, see, now I have to go back to you. No, I understand. I'm just teasing. So the United States starts to issue a lot of ideas and propaganda to the rest of the world that, you know what? Cuba cannot take care of herself. These are the bad Spanish guys who want to come hurt Cuba. Interesting that Cuba is in the form of like a helpless woman, right? This is not Wonder Woman down here who's kicking butt, right? This is some poor helpless woman who needs big old Uncle Sam with his big sword to come and get rid of the Spaniards. How do you think many Cubans felt about this? The United States stepping in their civil war against Spain. What do you think? I'm going to pick on you now. Go ahead, Emily.
They probably felt pretty so-so about it. Like, some people probably been like, yeah, we want freedom from the Spaniards, whereas others could have been just like, well, this is just as bad.
You're right. You hit the nail on the head. Many Cubans initially said, oh, heck yeah, Uncle Sam, we want you to help us get rid of the Spanish. Welcome, come on in, like Jose Marti and others. Yay, come on in. Oh, by the way, my specialty is Latin America history, so if I get too excited about anything dealing with Latin America, calm me down, temper me, say, whoa, Rodriguez, calm down. You're right, but eventually once Cubans and others see what the United States really wants to do, they start to not like it anymore and want their independence. This is the same with the Philippines. The Philippines, let me just remind you where it is on the map. The Philippines are way out here. And you might wonder, geez, why in the Philippines do they kind of speak Spanish? Their language has a lot of elements of Spanish in it. And why are they Catholic? Why are they Christian way over here in the Philippines? Well, it's because the Philippines have been a part of the Spanish Empire for hundreds of years. However, by the 1890s, a lot like Puerto Rico and Cuba, Filipinos wanted independence from Spain, just as the US had won independence from England. Okay. However, the United States, and the text goes into a lot more detail about this, so I could expand this a lot more, but I won't. So the United States decided to enter these different struggles, the Filipino struggle for independence against Spain and the Cuban struggle for independence against Spain. Americans entered what they call the Spanish-American War, and they did it in the name of doing what? What does this picture represent? Who's the one in the middle whose chains are being broken? Can you tell? What do you see, Emily, Joey, Rachel, Kaylee, Paxton, or Ari?
It's Cuban.
She's a young girl.
Yeah, see the young girl? Like, who doesn't want to free some young blonde little girl from chains, right? It's like the easiest sell in the world. Like, oh, look what we did, yay. Yeah, young girl.
What's interesting to...
Go ahead.
Sorry.
What's interesting is what?
Well, her crown says Cuba on it.
Mhm.
And I just find it interesting that, maybe I'm wrong, but like, that girl doesn't look Cuban to me. Like, she's blonde. That's not typically what Cuban people look like. So I find it interesting that they're representing like Latin American people with what appears to be a white girl to me, to make them seem, you know, so that people don't, so that the implicit biases people feel against dark skin aren't affecting the propaganda, I assume.
You're good. Implicit bias. You must be a Wiley student. I found a Wiley student right there. You're exactly right, Joey. Did you all hear what Joey said about that? Yeah, there are light-skinned, curly-haired people in Cuba from Spain, right? But the vast majority of Cubans are a lot darker skinned because the Spanish brought in thousands of Africans in order to be enslaved in the sugar fields and the coffee plantations of Cuba. So you're right, most Cubans are Afro-Cuban with a lot darker complexion. But there are also many lighter skinned, blonde, curly haired Cubans as well. But they're a minority, but you're right. It's not to trigger the implicit bias of many Americans against darker skinned, kinky haired people. Well done. And here is the North and the South. Also, this is a few decades after the US Civil War. So look how they're also bringing together the North and the South. They are making good again by saving Cuba and this little girl from the shackles of Spanish oppression. However, shortly after the United States entered the war, Spain says, okay, we surrender to you, the United States. So this is important. The Spanish surrendered the Filipino flag and the Cuban flag to United States forces, not Filipino or Cuban forces. So at the Treaty of Paris in 1899, who's not at the party? Who's missing from the party?
The people that were fought over, the Cubans and the Filipinos and stuff.
Yeah, there were no Cubans, no Puerto Ricans, no Filipinos invited to the party. As you all know, who's invited to the party and who's not invited to the party tells you about the party. All right. So by the late 1890s, the US gained more overseas colonies. Right now, the United States is claiming the Hawaiian Islands, but now we also claim America's Samoa, Guam, Wake, and the Filipino Islands, that were previously Spanish colonies. But we also claim Cuba and Puerto Rico down here. Okay. Why didn't we make them states? Why didn't they become states? Why not the state of the Philippines or the state of Cuba or Puerto Rico?
That gives them voting power that we didn't want them to have.
Yeah, just think if they get to vote. Just think if they get 2 senators. Whoa. So what about them? Why not give them voting power and why not give them statehood?
I imagine it had something to do with racism.
Yeah, the problem with the Philippines is it was full of Filipinos, right? And that goes the same with the United States and the Mexican War. When the United States defeated Mexico in the 1840s, one of the reasons why the US didn't annex more of Mexico is the senators said it straight up. The problem is it was full of Mexicans. Don't believe me. In 1848, Senator John Clark said on annexing more of Mexico after we defeated them in the war, right? We got California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, right? This big swath of the West. But he said to incorporate such a disjointed people and degraded masses to even a limited participation within our social and political rights would be fatally destructive to the institution of our country. There is a moral pestilence to such a Mexican people, which is contagious, a leprosy that will destroy. That's rough, isn't it? So the reason why we didn't take more of Mexico is because the Mexicans, similarly, the reason why we didn't turn the Philippines into a voting state is because it was full of Filipinos. And I think this cartoon captures this sentiment. Well, it captures a actually really interesting sentiment in American thought at the time. What's going on in this cartoon? I love using political cartoons for class. So here you have Uncle Sam with, in the front row, the new members of America. Here are the Filipinos, Hawaiians, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. And in the back, the very studious, nerdy students, California, Texas, Alaska, and others. Hold on. I think I might have people coming in. Are people trying to come in the class? Hold on, let me check. No. Okay. Oh, the ones in the front row are being scolded. Exactly right. Exactly right. Right, who's this? Do you see this one in the back? The Native American kid? And look how he has his book upside down. So there's the illiterate Native American kid. How can I see the chats? There we go, chats. Move them over there. And look at the African American kid, right? Not allowed, right? This is still a time of Jim Crow segregation, right? And they're being scolded, these new Americans. And who's not even allowed in the classroom? Who's this kid over there? Go ahead and chime in. You see the kid over there with the long braid looking thing? Yeah, Chinese kid. This is the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, in which we tried to kick out all Chinese from the United States after they built the railroad. Thanks for the railroad. Let me go to this. How do we move this out of here? All right. Okay. So from 1898 to 1934, the United States was this thing, this invented word, a protectorate. We didn't want to use the word colony because that would mean like we're like an empire like England was. And the United States didn't want to tell itself it was an empire. So we used up this literally made up word, a protectorate. Like, we're just going to protect Cuba. We're not going to let them vote or have senators, but we'll be good friends. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the Filipino guerrilla war, many Filipinos said, oh, heck no. We spent this much blood, treasure and blood fighting the Spanish just to replace it with the Americans? Oh, heck no. So this started one of the bloodiest guerrilla wars in US history. 1 million Filipinos died during this Filipino guerrilla war against the US. 5,000 US died during this war. However, most of the US casualties weren't through military combat. Do you know how most US soldiers died in the Filipinos? Can you guess?
I would guess disease, because it's a tropical environment.
Disease, exactly, tropical disease, malaria, yellow fever, and even dysentery, just from being sick. One of the Filipino leaders of independence was Emilio Aguinaldo. He went from fighting the Spanish to fighting the Americans. Here's an image of Filipino soldiers outside Manila. Unlike the Cuban soldiers against the Spanish, the Filipino soldiers had been fighting, anyway, they were a lot more well-trained, and they weren't conquered as quickly by US forces at all. It was a long and nasty, bloody guerrilla war. Plus, it was much, much further away, which caused all kinds of complications. Here's an image of US soldiers and their prisoners over here. I won't go too much into it because you can look at the slides if you want. But as with any guerrilla warfare, it was just nasty and bloody, right? Waterboarding did not start in Iraq in the 2000s, right? This form of torture had been around at least since the Spanish Inquisition, and even before that, of the the Spanish Inquisition of the 1600s and before that. How do you think many Americans felt about U.S. empire, U.S. territorial expansion and losing? How do you think people in the U.S. felt about this?
I've met people I've had teachers of not history usually, but like related subjects that will deny that the US ever had an empire. So I feel like there's that sort of purposeful ignorance. If that's still affecting it now, then I'm sure that affected it at the time.
Oh yeah, and I can go to historical conferences and people still debate as to whether we were an actual empire. That's why I'm asking you all. I want to get your take. After you read everything in this section, assignment 1, part 2, give me your take. And remember, this is a debatable word, right? I'm arguing yes, but I am one historian, right? This ain't Sunday and I ain't a preacher, okay?
What is the debate? I don't understand. Maybe I don't know the technical definition well enough, but like to me, we obviously are. So what is the argument?
You know what? Ask that in about 12 minutes when I'm done, okay?
Okay, sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I love it. I love the banter back and forth. The citizens probably either don't know or, yep, okay. Let's go back. Oh, share screen, Rodriguez. Share screen. Share screen. Many Americans celebrated empire. Look at this. This is a cover of a very famous magazine called Puck. And here is this woman. Imagine this hat. It even has like steam coming out of the hat. That is a rockin' hat. World Power hat. And there she is. It's called Columbia's Easter Bonnet, celebrating world power in 1901. And again, it wasn't just magazines. This is Senator Newt Nelson. That is a rockin' name. I like that name, Senator Newt. If any of y'all have kids, call him Newt. Or as they do up in Northern Europe, Canute. That's the original pronunciation, Canute. That's where we get the word knife and knight. So Senator Newt argued in 1899, Providence has given the United States the duty of extending Christian civilization. We come as ministering angels, not as despots. So Senator Nelson is arguing that as we expand into the Philippines and Cuba, we're also bringing civilization, American Christianity, and our development and way of life. He's saying we're coming as ministering angels to these folks, not as despots. Despots are a bad thing. Okay? That's one example about how, anyway, that's one for empire example. There was also these big expositions happening throughout the world at this time. This is the era of like great international exposition, sorry. This one was in Omaha, Nebraska, and it was called the First Colonial Exhibit. And it was a big celebration of America acquiring the Philippines. Here's Uncle Sam pointing to the Philippines and Cuba. And the argument was, we as white men have a burden to bring civilization to the savage brown people of the world. I'm not making this up, right? This is the argument that was made then. Please don't believe me. Really, I could be lying to you. And part of this white man's burden, this notion of it, was that American civilization will provide moral, economic, and spiritual uplift. For example, a cartoon in the Chicago Tribune of 1914 argued that before the US intervened on behalf of these oppressed people, the poor Filipinos were burdened with Spanish oppression, Hawaiians by industrial slavery, Puerto Ricans in Cuba were the yoke of Spanish domination, and Panama was suffering as well. Look what happens after US involvement. They turn into wealthy, look at, they're carrying bags of money. Dang, you get a suit and a bag of money. Sweet. All right. So this shows you that there was a propaganda war out there to convince the people in the United States as to the righteousness of the cause. On the other hand, there were people like philosopher and writer William James, who said in 1899, God damn the US for its vile conduct in the Philippine Islands. He was just one of many. You all are going to be reading both sides of the argument, how some people did not want an empire, how some people didn't. Okay? I look forward to reading what you have to say. Oh, a lot of words. But let me read to you Marine Major General Smedley Butler. He was called the Fighting Quaker because Quakers aren't supposed to fight. They're supposed to be pacifists, but he was no pacifist. He signed up for the Marines illegally when he was 15. He forged the documents. He wanted to be a member of the Marines so badly. He served with honor for many, many years, over 33 years in total. He was the first service person in the United States to win not one, but 2 medals of honor, right? So this guy was an American hero of the highest honor. However, by 1931, his attitude had soured about US policies abroad. So he retired from the Marines and then went on a speaking tour telling Americans what he felt he did in the name of the US. And let me just read through this, and I think it'll help you follow it. He said, I've spent 33 years in active military service. And during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of a half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House in 1902, 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. Looking back, here's a drop the mic moment. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts of Chicago. I operated on 3 continents. Dang, Smedley. Is that drop the mic worthy? Woo! All right, Smedley. So this is what these countries throughout Central America are what became banana republics. Have you heard of the term banana republics? What does that refer to? Rachel, I saw you mildly shake your head. I could be misjudging your mannerisms.
I remember hearing about it. Is it maybe some sort of Central American republic? I'm not sure, honestly.
It's all right. Kylie's got your back, or your cyber underneath in this. Have you heard the term banana republic? What does that mean, Kylie? Or Kaylee?
I haven't heard that before.
Okay.
So I wasn't really quite sure.
What it refers to as, usually after the United States intervened in these different nations, we imposed very US-friendly dictators and or presidents. So especially these countries in Central America and in Haiti had very US-friendly leadership on purpose because the United States went and made sure that their leaders were US-friendly. These were referred to as banana republics. Banana Republic, I do not know how this fancy, is this clothing store still around? Are they still around, the Banana Republic? I don't even know. Yeah, okay. So I don't know how this clothing store for these well-dressed, wealthy young people got the name, but the original Banana Republic has to do with this era. So was the US an empire? Well, the Filipinos finally won independence in 1946. So from 1898 to 1946, they were a US territory or colony without voting rights, without senators. Hawaii was a US territory for that long without senators, without voting rights until 1950. Cubans won their independence in a very bloody fashion after the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And unfortunately, after their revolution, it was replaced by a very stringent dictator who did bring about some social reforms, but at a very high political cost to the everyday Cubans. And Puerto Rico, is Puerto Rico independent? No. Puerto Rican independence. If you live in Puerto Rico, you are a US citizen, yet you don't have a congressman or you don't have senators, and you can't vote for a US president, right? So they're a citizen in name only, many would argue. Okay. Questions or comments? Does this help you maybe begin your understanding about, is the US an empire? Hopefully this will be an introduction. You can go read the text about it. All of chapter 21 is about this, and also that podcast. So let me go around. What struck you about this lecture? Ari, I know you have, can you unmute and offer something? Ari, what struck you about this? Or you can type it in. Are you there, Ari? I'm starting at the bottom of my screen. Oh, cool. Do y'all see Ari's chat stuff? The citizens probably either didn't know about it or didn't care of the US. We Americans are the saviors and teachers. Yeah, I gotcha. And that's why you all are in community. That's why you're all in college, right? Do they teach you this in middle school? They should. Middle school kids can handle it. Fifth grade kids can handle it. Show them those cartoons of the kids, the bad Cuban kids in the front. Pax or Paxton, can I pick on you? What struck you about this lecture? Any old thing?
I'm very interested to go into the learning of if the U.S. was an empire. I actually, when you guys brought that up, I was doing some research on that, so I'm excited to get into that because I actually did not know that. Sorry, what was that?
No, I'm interrupting you. Well, good.
No, I just was saying I didn't know that, and it's like really cool. So
yeah, you don't know what you don't know, right? We aren't born with this knowledge, and wouldn't that be weird if you were? You're like 1 year old full of all this knowledge. That'd be weird.
Yeah.
So no, this is the problem of our educational system, and welcome to college. This ain't the 13th grade. So welcome, Paxton. Kaylee, can I pick on you now? What struck you about this? Any old thing?
I kind of agreed with Paxton about it. Like, I didn't realize that was happening, like that ever happened before, and so it kind of was interesting, which made me kind of want to go, like, after this, go look into it more.
Well, exactly. You all are making me smile, whether or not you're making me smile. So can you all see my screen? So I am encouraging you to check out the podcast, because the podcast is going to talk about this Dr. Cornelius Rhodes and his experiments on Puerto Ricans at this time. He made the cover of Time magazine in 1949 by helping to combat cancer. He's the one who came up with chemotherapy. How he came up with chemotherapy is quite disturbing. So I encourage you to listen to the podcast in which they interviewed Daniel Imawar. All right, back to this. Stop share. So Rachel, can I go to you now, please?
Not to beat the empire horse, but I feel like there was plenty of evidence of an empire in this lecture, especially with the, honestly, manifest destiny is kind of an idea of like an empire in the first place and then expanding into other countries or other territories and fighting other countries for their territories. That seems pretty empirical to me.
Yeah, I agree. And you're going to see how there's more evidence in the podcast how more Filipinos died fighting the Japanese than Americans during World War II. Filipinos fought under the American flag. I mean, that's something I just really recently learned about. Thank you. All right. Joey, how about you?
I had kind of two, well, I have more than two, but I have two that I'm going to say. The first was like, I'm almost disturbed by how well hidden some of this information is by like the education system. Because I like history. I research history for fun, and I had never heard of the Filipino Guerrilla War. So that's probably my own fault to some extent, but it's like, how has this been hidden? I'm 20 years old. I should have heard this name before.
No, you're busy having a life taking care of all this thing. This is our job. This is the job of your historian. That's what we get paid to do. It's our bad, not your bad, Joey. So welcome. Welcome. I'm glad you know this. You know, it's going to be interesting for you all when you hear some of the anti-imperialist arguments, like by Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie wanted to cut the United States a check for $20 million and leave the Philippines. He said, because I don't want the Filipinos to be part of the United States. We should just leave. Don't go there. Don't mess around. So a lot of the anti-imperialist arguments are equally racist. Like, no, 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 we don't want to be part of the Philippines because it's full of Filipinos. All right, Emily and your lovely little puppy, what do y'all have to say?
Well, I just really appreciate the fact that as someone who's not into history, you're making it something we want to learn about. Like you were saying, how we're going to go into greater detail about Roosevelt's presidency and different things of that aspect, which in the very beginning of the lecture I found really interesting.
Well, good. And well, thank you very much. And it is interesting. The only boring thing about history is they're historians usually. And
Yeah.
hey, believe me, so remember in this class, you don't have to memorize names or dates. That's what Google's for, right? I just want you to know the larger schemes. Let me inspire you to look further by, you know what, I'm gonna stop the recording because it gets too big.